Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. We are joined by John from Jolan Consulting again, and a very big supporter and partner of the Wheatbelt Business Network. And today John is presenting on quite a good topic for this particular time in our communities and our businesses. And the topic today is a vaccine for anxiety. So I would like to pass on to John.
Thank you, Caroline. Hello there, everyone. A very special welcome to you, particularly the members of the Wheatbelt Business Network. This short webinar is designed to enhance your awareness of what could be happening in your current work and lifestyle as a result of this global pandemic, anxiety. The information and suggestions made today are designed as a vaccine, if you like, to assist you in your management of such an issue. I will make the point that the information and details included in the webinar are generously shared by a colleague of mine in New Zealand, David Morrison-Jones. We share information regularly, and we try to support each other in similar projects. David is a very experienced consultant who has worked with small and large corporations, and his knowledge is extensive. And this personal development area is one where he demonstrates particular expertise. So at the conclusion of the webinar, I will be happy to provide David's summary of some of the details presented. So, vaccines. Vaccines really reduce the risk of infection by working with the body's natural defence system to safely develop immunity to disease. Now, these techniques, hang on, we'll just go on to the next slide there. Right, these techniques, they apply to any stressful situation. David said himself that he has some skin in the game because his income dropped by about 70% prior to Christmas. And also his wife had to suffer the death of her mother. Back in the 1990s, I was involved in supplying staff to educational institutions in Hong Kong. We had 20 candidates ready to go when the SARS virus, and some of you may remember, hit, and 16 pulled out. And we were paid when the staff arrived in Hong Kong. So this left us with a huge debt. And with something like less than 20% return on investment. I had to admit at that stage, financially, I wasn't feeling in control. So, what we're going to cover in this webinar is that what this pandemic has done is provided us with a number of what we would call inconvenient truths. We will also make reference to how the mind is actually a muscle, and then looking at the ways in which we can develop resilience and also some skill set and techniques. Now, interestingly enough, when COVID-19 first hit and lockdown started, in the UK, for example, bikes sold out. And people had to find ways to exercise. However, what we're going to be talking about today is exercise for the mind, which is also helpful, and in some ways, and for other people, many ways, it's essential. So, an inconvenient truth is one that is clouded with uncertainty. No one knows whether a vaccine will be produced through this global pandemic in 12 to 18 months, could be longer, could be many months away, and there's also the possibility of it never having a vaccine. So one of the things with the global pandemic, yes, you can look at distancing, and you also have to understand that these vaccines are being developed around the world. And so distance and hygiene that we're starting to get used to is still awaiting a vaccine. And there is this uncertainty. I want to highlight for you just the way in which different personality types, which is something that people know I'm very passionate about in one of our focus workshops, types will respond differently. Extroverts and introverts, they'll magnify their responses to such challenges. If you have a look at what COVID has done, it's magnified the worst elements of people like Donald Trump. Loud, they'll blame others. The largest home lender in New Zealand, from what I understand, has seen in excess of 30% of customers to change their refinancing or interest only or a mortgage holiday. In Australia, it's almost identical. And some people, as a result, they become overloaded, almost paralysed. And when you add in the stress for family, finances, and job insecurity, you can understand the increase and significant rise in anxiety. People become overloaded, overwhelmed, stuck. So one way of looking at it, I suppose, is that when it's a recession is when your neighbour, colleague loses their job. When you lose your job, it almost becomes depression. And I think that's important to understand in this case. The other part is that if you look at what the media is doing, this is part of the inconvenient truth. It looks pretty grim. You'll get headlines that will actually tell you this is the worst recession we've had in 300 years and we have to move forward. But just listening to the media is very disruptive to thought patterns. We have rather, well, the media has rather rigid thought patterns in a lot of cases. So what we have to do is face it and not pull up the covers. And that lovely quote there from Theodore Roosevelt, in any moment of decision, the best thing you can do is the right thing. The next best thing is the wrong thing. And the worst thing is to do nothing. So in facing these inconvenient truths, I want you to have a look at this particular slide about a plan. Does this look familiar? Your plan is that life needs to go on and this is what you plan. However, the reality is that you have all these peaks and troughs. And if you look very closely at the graphic, you'll see some of them are actually quite nice. There are other times you feel as though you're dangling in midair. And that is the current reality. So when you actually have a plan, sometimes you will feel as though it's kind of not going to plan. So, to deal with the situation rather than it dealing to you. Some of you might be familiar with Stephen Covey and his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. One of the things that Covey provides us is with a model. And if you look at the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see what we call the circle of concern. But inside that is the circle of influence. And one of the things that we would probably suggest in this process is don't spend time in the circle of concern look to expand your circle of influence and look at what you can influence in your realm. So if you look down in the circle of concern in the blue, you'll see that a lot of things like social media feeds, the economy, the news, of course, all the information about the coronavirus, political issues, and other people's behaviour. However, the aspects in your circle of influence are your own attitude, your own behaviour, what you watch on TV, what you read, and what you surround yourself with, or people who you surround yourself with, and what do you post on social media, etc. So if you take the little suggestion there in dealing with the situation rather than it dealing with you, the suggestion here is spend more time in your circle of influence and less time in the circle of concern. During the lockdown, people have been focused somewhat on physical health. But what about bench pressing your brain for challenging times? It's amazing to see the change when one does. And when people move from, I'm not good at this, to, I haven't perfected this yet, is a change of attitude. See, the brain is about 1.5 kilos. It's relative to body size of all the largest vertebrates. It provides 20% of the body's energy, 20%. So it requires food and exercise daily, and that means for the brain. So how we deal with our inner world drives every aspect of how we live, even though it only supplies 20% of the body's energy. It's, I suppose, part of that thing about trying to teach an old dog new tricks. But what we need to do in this particular process is probably reframe the inconvenient truths. Just on its own is not enough. You need to actually go back and almost retrain. Very interesting study of Canadians. They did a study of 74-year-olds, and it was done in a Canadian rest home, where the average physical age of the residents, the group was split into, was 74. But what they did was they split the group into two. The first group were paired up and taken for a 20-minute walk with a caregiver twice a week. The control group, they just undertook the normal, what they would call sedentary life. And after a year, the first group had a cognitive age of a 68-year-old, and they saw a marked reduction in anxiety. And so the whole point of this research, I suppose, and the point of making it here is that neuroplasticity can occur at any age. So even for people in what we would talk about their twilight years, you can actually do this. And I suppose going back to re-emphasize the point I made earlier about developing exercise for the brain as a way of reducing anxiety. If you have a look at this page here, I want to make reference here to what we would call the limbic part of the brain. It's often referred to as the reptile brain, developed some 150 million years ago, and the amygdala is a key component of the limbic system. But this part of the brain is responsible for the flight, the fight, or the freeze we experience when we perceive a threat, something uncomfortable, like an uncomfortable meeting, or more usefully, if you're involved and you're driving your car and another car is hurtling towards you. It's the important, what we would call survival mechanism, which can actually cripple our ability to think, as it, one, cannot differentiate between the car and the uncomfortable meeting, which is not life-threatening. But it also hijacks and closes down the prefrontal cortex, which houses the executive functions such as logic and thinking. So if you have an awareness of this process, and that's all we're trying to do is just give you an awareness, then you can ensure that you get the prefrontal cortex of your brain back online for processing and thinking. Because if you have a look here, the red mind, it handles survival mechanism. It focuses on fear. It's about whether I flight or I fight or I freeze. The red side shuts down the blue, whereas the blue side is slower to switch on, but the blue mind focuses on whether we need to know it or whether it's a threat or a challenge. It's the processing capacity of one. So from that point of view, it's all our thinking. Why are we mentioning this here? Well, unless we understand how the brain works, for example, if you go to a gym or you go to some kind of exercise class, one of the things instructors will do is they will provide you with background information about how your muscle works, etc. That's what we're trying to do here, is just give you some background explanation to say that your brain needs exercise, and how you exercise that brain can have a significant impact on the way in which you manage anxiety. So what we're trying to do is, I suppose, we're trying to reframe the brain. So I'll give you one here. Trying to decide between a threat versus a challenge, and the reframing the situation to see it as a challenge. For example, if you have a look at what tennis players do in between points, there's usually 10 to 15 seconds. In a lot of cases, what they try and do is they relax. They take 3 deep breaths, and you watch them before they play the next point. Even though they might have lost the point before, they've got to reframe. So our minds are a little bit similar. We're often caught up in our day-to-day worries and anxieties, constantly mulling over them in our heads. But if we just stop fretting for a while, we'll be able to focus on the present and focus that with greater clarity. So the question is, I suppose, how do you clear the sediment in your mind? If in doubt, do an activity in your mind or your body. So the thing that you can do when you start to reframe the situation is that you have to power up your decision-making skills. And the best way of doing that is with a clear mind. Slower, simpler, calmer and clearer. And just think of the tennis breathing or the tennis breath that they use in between sets or a game. And when you watch them, what they do is they actually just make that space. So creating some thinking space is very important. And some people do it with an activity, they can do it with their hands, they can go for a walk, they just do something to break the cycle of thinking. So if you come back to the earlier point to say, okay, well, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to give our brain some exercise so that when we have all this information coming at us, it can be a threat. But if we start to train our brain to understand that really it's a challenge more than a threat, and bringing that thinking practice into it. So just because you think something, it doesn't make it real or true. So that's part of the reason why we've got to power up our decision-making skills with a clear mind. The key word here is ability. Here's a definition: an ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. And as I just emphasised, the key word in this one is ability. Funnily enough, it's not something we're all born with. We train it, and we train it to take the load. So one of the parts here is that we have to understand, okay, well, if I'm going to be able to do this and develop resilience, therefore I actually have to train for it. It's not something that we are going to be all born with, but it's something we can develop. And so therefore, it's going to take practice. And secondly, you're not going to be good at it immediately the first time you try it. But developing resilience actually requires a game plan and some kind of action. I mean, if you wanted to make it sort of part of your pattern, then you would help yourself if you did it a couple of times a week, even more. What this is probably based on that whole premise of the power of marginal gains, which we've got at the bottom of the screen there. So what's the game plan? The game plan is to improve our ability to tolerate emotional stress. And where does the emotional stress come from? Well, it's coming from a lot of that outer area of concern rather than the influence. The action, the way in which you do it, you can assess it, you can write it down on a post-it note. Ask yourself, well, what is working well? What do I want more of? What do I want less of? And where am I vulnerable? Because you are the only person who can determine where you are vulnerable. So that you can work out what to insert in your day. The power of marginal gains is a slowly, step-by-step process. The distance between the margins will become less and less the more practiced you become at it. I understood recently that a colleague of mine was starting to suffer quite a bit of stress as a result of just listening to the news every hour. Now, when people probably suggested, well, the news is not going to change much during the day. You'll get updates, but it's basically the same. So if you want to know what's happening, tuning in once a day is probably ample. And therefore, spending your time focusing on other things and training your brain to actually make decisions between what is real and what's not is a very, very good step. So the game plan and the action is that you want to improve your own ability to tolerate emotional stress. And this is called resilience. So therefore the action, each person will probably use some kind of plan to try and do that. But each person will have a different approach to it as well. So some people may use post-it notes, others might use a different way of recording about how they're feeling, what they want more of and what they want less of. But it also almost becomes a goal as well. So the skill set will not work, of course, if your mindset is wrong. So you'll get stuck. And we have to understand that we have here the opportunity of working with your heart, your brain, and your body. And one of the things is here is connect, work, and activity. In other words, stay in contact, don't get isolated, In other words, who will I catch up with, when, how? Pick up the phone. And these have been mentioned before in some of the workshop information we've provided. Secondly, ensure that the work that you're doing is meaningful and productive. Now, by that meaningful, it doesn't mean to say that it all has to be job or work related. The work that you do can be your ordinary everyday activities, but what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, and how. And as you become more experienced in training yourself this way and the way in which you're thinking, you will find that you will need less of these little helps or hints in terms of building your skill set. It will become part of your normal operational style. And the third one there about activity, energising. Now, for some people, energising means getting out and pumping the pavement. But for some other people, that may even be reading something interesting or getting engaged in something. So what you do, when you do it, and how you do it. The secret here is not to get stuck. This is about what we would call developing a useful mindset. David shared with me some information about something that happened in New Zealand, and he said that Grant Robertson is the finance minister, and Rob Fyfe is the ex-CEO of Air New Zealand. So during the COVID lockdown, Rob Fyfe was asked to see how big business and government together could work together in addressing some of the supply options. Now, he managed to secure early on in the piece $70 million worth of PPE. So he went back to the minister's department to get payment, and they replied, well, that's not the way we do things here. And it's a very good example of what we call a fixed mindset. So he went to some business people and they advanced the funds to secure the PPE. Now, that's what we call a useful mindset. So what we're trying to do here is, once again, part of your skill set, you've got to develop what we call a useful mindset. And that useful mindset is expanding your own circle of influence, to go back to Stephen Covey's point. So it cannot change the situation only by your reaction to it. But you've got to be positive and don't overplay the hand. In other words, learning how to change your state, move physically, and how you move mentally. But going back to that little suggestion there, don't get stuck, because that kills focus, it kills confidence, and it also kills productivity. See, there's a female athlete that I read about recently who was always happy, always joyful, etc. She's an elite triathlete who was always very upbeat. But it was false. When she emotionally crashed, it was a big fall. What she needed was a mindset that had the optimistic outlook, which noted what's the reality here and the reality she faced, so that she could look at how to overcome them. One of the interesting sideline points here, I also, through David, read about Nick Gill, who was the strength and the conditioning coach for the All Blacks. And he advocates that every person should be doing squats daily, as you lose functional strength after 40. And the number one reason why people get or end up being in places like nursing homes, etc., is their inability to get on and off the toilet, because they lose functional strength in their legs. It's just a little sideline example, but I think it fits very, very well. So one of the things that we want to just quickly summarise in this whole process, firstly, face the inconvenient truths, because in some cases you've got no control over them. Secondly, you want to learn to strengthen the thinking brain through regular practice. And that comes through a body and mind connection. But going back to making marginal gains with lots of practice, what you're doing is you're building the skill set to support the mindset. And the important part through all of this is don't get stuck. So, and if you are able to either do this yourself or with other people, you will find that gradually you will have more confidence and you will be more capable of doing it. The other thing is your own brain will become used to such things. Therefore, your ability to handle anxiety and a range of other connected issues will be a lot easier, because you will actually have a much stronger capacity to make decisions and put in place that skill set. This takes courage, and courage is what you will need when you are stuck. You taste fear, you will bend, wobble, get the jitters, etc. But keep moving. Don't get stuck, because momentum comes from moments of movement. And what we're talking about there is not momentum physically, it's momentum mentally. So if you keep moving mentally forward, what you're doing is you're making gains all the time. Because in the long run, fear is a reaction, courage is a decision. So let's just have a look at your decision framework. Here's a little, I suppose, exercise in asking you to get into the practice when you are confronted with an anxious situation. Ask yourself, what am I trying to achieve? Why am I trying to achieve it? What am I planning to do? What action am I planning? And is the benefit worth the risk? In other words, what's the outcome that I want, which is what you're trying to achieve and why you're trying to achieve it. So that's your decision framework. The fact that you go through that exercise mentally is actually enhancing that part of your brain that's actually going to be much stronger. So a lot of people during this whole pandemic have been focusing very much on their physical health, etc. What we're suggesting here to cope with the other issues that anxiety brings on, we're trying to get you to start developing your own mental strength. And the brain is that muscle that actually does need exercise. So there you are. I would be quite comfortable in sharing with anyone, and I'll work through the Wheatbelt Business Network for this. A simple set of notes which will summarise that for you, and therefore we can provide that back to you.
Thank you very much, John. That was really good, and I think one of the big things that we've been trying to talk to our business members has been about controlling the controllables. And yes, you have that sphere of influence and what you can control, which is a little bit like what you, well, which was exactly what you were talking about with that circle of influence and everything else around it. And the other thing I was thinking about was that it takes awareness to know how to react, I suppose. So, yeah, what you presented was really good, and it is a skill to know and know how to respond and be calm and to think things through and take your time. It's a learnt skill, I think.
Well, I think I've mentioned before in one of the previous presentations, if you want to change behaviour, there are 3 steps, and you've just hit the first one, and that is awareness. The second step, responsibility. The third step is action. And when you look at the details behind this information, you'll see that what we're trying to do is heighten that the brain actually is a muscle that requires training. But what we're getting from a lot of different sources is all this pressure. And therefore people start to feel anxious because they're either possibly losing their job, their income, etc., etc. What we're saying, that's part of the reality. However, if we're aware of what our thinking can do, then we look at and say, okay, I can do something about this. And that's taking responsibility. And the final couple of slides there will say, well, what's the game plan? How do I make this into a game plan? The moment you go through all 3 steps, you actually do change behaviour. And with those small marginal gains, if you like, regularly, you actually become stronger. And that to me is people who can actually do that and manage through it, I think are actually going to have a skill that actually becomes part of their persona.
Agree. Thank you very, very much, John, and also to your business colleague, David, who has helped with that content. It was really good, and I know our members will greatly benefit from that, and it's something that they can watch at any point in time.
Yes.
So yeah, thank you very much.
All right.